Hey there everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel, Strix Outdoors. In this video series, I'm going to show you how I do my own turkey fan mounts. This is part one of that video series, and in this video I'm going to go over the materials that you're going to need and how I go about cleaning up the turkey fan and getting it ready to set on the board to dry. So let's go over some of the things that you're going to need. So starting out with the 20 Mule Team Borax, you can find this at your supermarket. Generally it'll be in the laundry detergent section, typically. It's a good idea to have some good latex or rubber gloves. A sharp knife like this Havalon scalpel is really helpful. I find using a little pair of scissors like these are kind of a surgical type scissor, also helps. Another tool that's helped me out a lot are these flat side cutters, a wire brush, some napkins, and of course the material that you're going to set the fan on. Now I like to use a piece of cardboard when I'm cleaning the fan. But then ultimately you can either use a nice thick piece of cardboard, a big piece of styrofoam, or maybe poster board that you would use for like science fair projects and things like that, to ultimately be able to pin the fan on to set it to dry. Of course you'll also need some straight pins. Now I'm going to put links to all this stuff in the description below so you can get a little bit more information and also some places where you might be able to pick them up if you don't have this stuff already. Alright, so let's get started. Okay, so here we got our turkey fan and beard. I'm just going to start with the beard first on trimming this up, and this is pretty straightforward. That's pretty much it right there. It helps to have a plastic bag to put all the bits and pieces as you trim off. Okay, now here we have our turkey fan. Now one thing of note, especially if you haven't killed a turkey yet, you're just looking at this video before the season, what I like to do is when I cut the tail off, I start from the back end and I cut right above the vent, right at the base of the tail, and then as I come forward I try to get as much of this skin as I can. So this just gives you some options. You know, not everyone likes to have a lot of these feathers up here, but at least you have them and you can make that decision as you work on the bird. Now with that said, I don't ever leave these back feathers, so that's what I'm going to start with, is just trimming all this stuff off. Alright, now the objective in this step is to remove all of the flesh and as much of the fat as we possibly can from the turkey quills or the feathers of the tail, right? So we're going to start working through here with our knife, with our scissors, clippers, and brush to really try to clean all this up. Now one of the very first things that you're going to run into as you start doing that is that there's a bone here and it's connected in a couple pieces, and this is where those clippers really come in handy. So I'll just grab these and find where the bone connects and I'll snip in there. So you want to snip underneath and also at the top over here. So there you go, there's that piece that I was telling you about. So I've got that out of the way now. Now we'll continue using the Havalon knife to really trim off all this meat. And don't be scared to get in there, it's actually really hard to cut through those quills. It's easier to use these scissors and just chop off some of these pieces instead of the knife, so I like having these as well. Now this is looking pretty good so far. Now one thing I wanted to point out is down in here in the base there's this little spot that actually has some, I think they're oil glands or some fatty gland that it's really beneficial if you go ahead and remove as well. It's kind of hard to see, but as I cut through it, you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. So these were basically it, but you need to be careful as you cut through there because you can cut through the skin a bit, and depending on what you want to do with this front set of feathers, you just need to be careful. I actually ended up cutting through the skin here as I was removing those, but it's still attached on the other side, so it's going to be okay. Alright, this is looking pretty good. We've got most of the meat off, but there's still quite a bit of fat in between all these quills. And this is where that wire brush and paper towel come in handy. So you just get your wire brush and start working kind of in between those main quills. Just trying to get as much of that fat and stuff out of there. And you can also kind of cut between them. Make it a little bit easier to get in there. Okay, well, I think that's looking pretty good. We've got a lot of the fat removed. There's still more, and you can keep working on this and really clean that up some more. I know some people will go through and do like a degreasing on this. You can put it in some Dawn dish soap, soak it a little bit, and then dry it. I don't find that to really be necessary. The borax will really take care of it, in my opinion, but you know, a professional taxidermy guy might disagree. Now, before we move on to the next steps, one thing that you might want to determine here is how much of this stuff you want to keep. At the front, I like to keep a few layers of this. I say at a minimum you want to do, so this is the primary layer back up here of the big feathers, then you have the secondary layer of big feathers, and then you get into multiple layers of these other front feathers that actually have a lot of color in them here. So this is really to your preference. I like to leave the majority of them. Let's also cover cleaning up the spurs. Now, I used a hacksaw to cut these off from the legs, and then basically what you do is you start trimming off the scaly part of the legs to expose the bone and leave it nice and clean. So I still have a little bit more work to do here, and I'm going to use a combination of the clippers and the knife to get there. You'll also want to get the stuff that's left inside of the bone marrow and sinew, whatever else. Helps to have a little stick or a wire just to push all that stuff out. Now you'll notice that these aren't the same length, but that's okay. I just did a rough cut whenever I trimmed these off. I'm going to come back and trim these up and make them nice and equal and more uniform looking for the final product. So I washed these up and got them cleaned up a little bit more. I'm just going to trim off little bits. The bone has a little bit of a film on it that you'll also want to try to scrape off and remove just to get it nice and down to the bare bone. Now I'm going to go ahead and trim this up now before I put this in the borax, just because the bone is a little bit softer. Right now it'll be a little bit easier to trim. Now, this doesn't have to be perfect, but just trying to get it lined up. I've got this little Japanese flush cut saw that I'm going to use. You can also use a hacksaw. make a couple of reference marks there. Now, to be honest, you can avoid all of that if you just cut these to the right size initially. I generally cut these initially off the bird with just a pair of loppers that you would use for trimming trees, and that actually works pretty well, and it does a pretty clean cut that you can always come back and polish off with sandpaper. But since I didn't do this, and these have been in the freezer for a while, I didn't want to take the risk of shattering the bone by using the lopper, so I had to use the cut-off saw or a hacksaw to trim them up. All right, folks, well, that's the end of part one. We've got the fan and all the other parts cleaned up and ready to pin up on the board. So if you haven't done so already, be sure to hit the like button if you're finding this information useful. Subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you'll be notified when part two comes out. In part two, what I'm going to go over is how we're going to treat this with borax, how I pin it on cardboard or whatever the material is going to be, and ultimately how I end up mounting it to the plaque. So be sure to stay tuned for that. Well, everyone, good luck out there this turkey season, and I'll see you in the next video.